Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a story that's going to feel like pulling back a beautifully embroidered curtain, only to find the fabric underneath is torn, patched, and held together with sheer stubbornness. You know Laura Ingalls Wilder. You've seen her face on book covers, heard her voice in your childhood, watched her family cross the prairie in wagons on television screens. She's America's pioneer sweetheart, the little girl with the sunbonnet, the woman who taught us that hard work, family and faith could conquer anything. But tonight, you're not meeting that Laura. Tonight you're meeting the real one. The one who spent decades rewriting her own past, who buried secrets so deep that even her daughter had to dig them up and reshape them into something publishable. The one who turned financial disasters into cozy frontier adventures. The one who scrubbed racism from her memories and replaced it with nostalgia. You're about to walk into the gap between the myth and the truth, and that gap, it's a canyon. Let's start with what you think you know. The Little House books are wholesome, right? Heartwarming tales of a family that worked hard, moved west, and built a life with their bare hands. Pa plays the fiddle. Ma keeps a clean house. Laura and Mary grow up strong and good. It's the American dream written in calico and wagon grease, except it's not quite true. Laura Ingalls Wilder didn't write those books to tell you what really happened. She wrote them to survive, and survival, as you're about to see, sometimes means rewriting history until it's pretty enough to sell. The books debuted in the 1930s during the Great Depression, when people were desperate for stories that reminded them of simpler times, times when hard work meant something, when families stuck together, when the frontier was a blank slate and you could just start over if things went wrong. But here's the thing about the frontier. It wasn't blank, and the Ingalls family. They didn't just start over. They ran, over and over again, from debts, from failures, from land they had no legal right to occupy in the first place. And Laura knew it. She remembered it. But she also knew that nobody wanted to read about that. So she changed it. You see, the Little House books aren't a documentary. They're a carefully crafted mythology. Laura took her childhood. A childhood filled with poverty, displacement, illegal squatting, Zoan racial tension, and she turned it into something that could be consumed by children. Something that could teach lessons. Something that could make money. And it worked. The books became beloved. They became canonical. They became the story that America told itself about its own past. But the real story, the one Laura and her daughter Rose buried under layers of editorial polish and invented dialogue, that story is darker, messier, more human. And that's the story we're telling tonight. Let's talk about Laura Ingalls Wilder as she really was. Not as a character in her own books, but as a woman who lived through more failure than success, who watched her father chase dream after dream until the family was left with nothing, who married a man as unlucky as her father, and who didn't find financial stability until she was in her 60s, not from farming, but from writing. The real Laura was sharp. She was observant. She remembered everything. But she also understood something crucial. Memory is a story you tell yourself. And if you're going to tell that story to the world, you'd better make it one they'll pay for. So she did. She took the hunger and made it quaint. She took the fear and turned it into adventure. She took the racism. Oh, we'll get to that. And she either softened it or erased it entirely, depending on what her editors and daughter thought would sell. By the time the Little House series was published, Laura was an old woman looking back on a hard life, and she made a choice. She would control the narrative. She would decide what people remembered about the frontier, about her family, about herself. And for decades, it worked. But now we know better. Historians have gone back. They've checked the census records, the land claims, the newspaper accounts. They've read Laura's unpublished manuscripts and compared them to the final books. They've traced the Ingalls family's path across the Midwest and found the gaps, the lies, the convenient omissions. And what they've found is a family that was, in many ways, a case study in everything that could go wrong on the American frontier. Charles Ingalls, Pay, wasn't a heroic pioneer. He was a man who couldn't hold on to land, couldn't keep a job, couldn't stop moving long enough to let his family put down roots. He was charming, sure. He could play the fiddle and tell a good story, but he was also reckless. He dragged his wife and daughters from Wisconsin to Kansas to Minnesota to Iowa to Dakota Territory always chasing the next opportunity, always convinced that this time it would be different. It never was. Carolyn Ingalls, Ma, wasn't the serene, patient saint from the books. She was a woman who buried a baby brother during an epidemic, who married at 21 and spent the next 3 decades following a man whose dreams were bigger than his ability to achieve them. She kept her family fed and clothed through sheer force of will, and she did it with almost no help and almost no money. But Laura didn't write about that part. Not really. She wrote about Ma's clean kitchen and her pretty china. She wrote about the family singing together in the evenings. She didn't write about the fear, the exhaustion, the quiet rage of a woman who deserved better. And the children, Laura and Mary and Carrie and Grace, they grew up in a childhood that was by any measure unstable. They moved constantly. They lived in dugouts and claim shanties and poorly built cabins. They went hungry. They watched their parents fail again and again, and they learned early that the world was not kind to people like them. But you wouldn't know that from the books. In the books, the Ingalls family is resilient and hopeful and good. They face challenges, yes, but they overcome them with hard work and love and faith. It's inspirational. It's also a lie. Not a complete lie, mind you. Laura wasn't inventing things out of whole cloth. She really did live in a little house in the big woods. She really did cross the prairie in a covered wagon. She really did survive a winter so brutal that it nearly killed her entire town. But she left out the context, the desperation, the illegality, the racism, the fact that her father's repeated failures weren't noble struggles. They were just failures. And she left out the biggest secret of all, that she didn't actually write the books alone. Her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, was a successful writer in her own right. And Rose didn't just edit Laura's manuscripts. She rewrote them. She invented scenes. She changed the structure. She added dialogue and descriptions and entire chapters that Laura never wrote. In some cases, it's unclear where Laura's voice ends and Rose's begins, and that's the story Netflix won't touch. Because it's messy, it's uncomfortable. More, it forces you to ask questions about authorship and memory and the stories we tell about ourselves. But tonight, we're asking those questions. You're about to meet the real Ingalls family. The one that squatted illegally on Osage land. The one that went hungry more often than not. The one that survived not because they were exceptional, but because they were stubborn. And you're about to meet the real Laura Ingalls Wilder, the woman who took all that pain and failure and turned it into a story that would outlive her by generations. The woman who lied to make it beautiful. Dim your lights, get comfortable. And let's walk into the truth. You're standing in a clearing in the big woods of Wisconsin. It's 1867, and you're 5 years old. The trees around you are so thick that even in the middle of the day, the light filters through the leaves in soft, dappled greens. You can hear the sound of an axe biting into wood somewhere nearby. That's your father, Charles Ingalls, working. You don't know it yet, but this is the first place you'll lose. Laura was born in a log cabin in Pepin, Wisconsin, in February of 1867. The cabin was small, 1 room, dirt floor, a fireplace for cooking and heat. It was the kind of place that sounds romantic when you read about it in a book. But when you actually live there, it's cold and smoky and you can hear mice in the walls at night. Charles and Caroline had moved there shortly after they married. Charles had built the cabin himself, and for a while, it looked like they might make it work. He hunted, he farmed a little. Caroline kept house and took care of baby Mary, and then Laura when she came along. But Charles wasn't the kind of man who could sit still. He had a restlessness in him. A belief that somewhere out there, just over the next hill or across the next state line, there was a better opportunity waiting. Land that was richer, game that was more plentiful, a chance to really make something of himself. So when Laura was still a toddler, he started talking about leaving. Caroline didn't want to go. She had family in Wisconsin. She had a community. She had a life that, while hard, was stable. But Charles was convinced. And in the 1860s, a wife didn't have much say in the matter, so they packed up the wagon, they sold what little they had, and they left. You're in the wagon now. You're 2 years old, maybe 3. You don't understand what's happening, but you can feel your mother's tension. She's holding baby Mary in one arm and trying to keep you from falling out of the wagon with the other. Your father is driving, talking about all the things you'll do when you get to Kansas, all the land you'll have, all the opportunities. Your mother says nothing. The journey takes weeks. You sleep under the wagon at night, listening to the sound of prairie wind and your father's snoring. During the day, you watch the landscape change. The trees thin out, the grass gets taller, the sky gets bigger. And then, one day you arrive. This is Kansas, Indian Territory. The land your father has chosen is beautiful. Rolling prairie, a creek nearby, timber for building. It seems perfect. There's just one problem. You're not supposed to be here. The land Charles has claimed is part of the Osage Diminished Reserve. That means it belongs to the Osage Nation. The federal government has promised them that white settlers won't be allowed to take it. But Charles doesn't care. Or maybe he doesn't know. Or maybe, and this is more likely, he knows, and he's gambling that the government will change its mind and open the land to settlement before anyone makes him leave. So he builds a house, not a cabin this time, but an actual house. Logs chinked with clay, a real floor, glass windows. He's so proud of it. He's sure this is where the family will finally put down roots. You live there for 2 years. You have memories of this place. Good ones, mostly. You remember playing in the tall grass. You remember your father carrying you on his shoulders. You remember the way the wind sounded at night. You also remember the Osage men who sometimes came by. Your father was friendly with them, traded with them, but your mother was afraid. Laura would later write about this fear in her books, and it's one of the parts that makes modern readers deeply uncomfortable. Because the fear wasn't justified. The Osage weren't a threat. They were people who had been promised that this land would be theirs, and now white families were moving onto it anyway. But Laura, writing decades later, portrayed them as dangerous, as something to be afraid of. She would later try to soften this in revised editions, but the damage was done. The racism was baked into the text. And here's the thing. Even as a child, Laura knew the Osage had a right to be angry. She remembered a conversation she overheard between her father and a neighbour, where the neighbour said they'd all have to leave soon because the government was going to enforce the treaty, and that's exactly what happened. In 1870, the federal government told the white settlers in the Osage Reserve to get out. Some of them protested. Some of them tried to fight it. But eventually they all left, including the Ingalls family. You're in the wagon again. You're 5 now, old enough to understand that you're leaving, old enough to feel the loss. Your father built that house with his own hands. Your mother had made it a home, and now you're abandoning it. Your father talks about going back to Wisconsin, about starting over, about how it'll be better this time. Your mother says nothing. And this is the pattern that will define your childhood. Your father makes a plan. He builds something. He believes, Enos truly believes, that this time it will work, and then it doesn't. And you pack up the wagon and leave, again and again and again. By the time you're 10 years old, you will have lived in 4 different states. You'll have gone to school in 3 different towns. You'll have made friends and left them behind so many times that eventually you'll stop trying. You'll learn that nothing is permanent, that home is just a word, that your father's promises are made of air. And you'll also learn something else, that if you want to survive, you have to be tougher than the world around you. You have to be smart. You have to pay attention. You have to remember. Because someday, you're going to write all of this down, and when you do, you'll leave out the parts that hurt too much to say. You'll make your father a hero. You'll make the moves sound like adventures. You'll make the hunger sound like character-building hardship. But deep down, you'll remember the truth. You'll remember that your childhood wasn't an adventure. It was a series of losses, and the only reason you survived it was because your mother held the family together with nothing but sheer will and a refusal to give up. You'll remember that your father's dreams were beautiful, but they were also selfish, that every time he moved the family he was gambling with their lives, and you'll remember the Osage family whose land you took, even if just for 2 years. You'll remember that the house your father built shouldn't have been built at all, but in the books, you'll make it sound like fate, like manifest destiny, like it was always supposed to happen. Because that's the story America wanted to hear, and you'll give it to them. You're 7 years old, standing in a field in Minnesota, and you're watching your father plant wheat. He's talking, the way he always does, about how this crop is going to change everything. How next year you'll have enough money to buy a new stove for your mother, maybe even a piano, You don't believe him. Not really. You've heard this before. But you watch him anyway. You watch the way he moves, the way he jokes with your mother even though she's exhausted, the way he ruffles your hair and tells you to run along and play. And you remember it. You remember all of it. Because that's what Laura did. She was a child who paid attention, a child who absorbed every detail of the world around her, even when that world was hard and ugly and unfair. Most children forget their early years. The memories blur, fade, get replaced by stories other people tell them. But Laura didn't forget. She held on to everything. The sound of the wagon wheels on dirt roads, the taste of cornbread made with too little salt, the way her mother's hands looked after a day of washing clothes in creek water. She remembered the fear, the hunger, the long silences between her parents when money ran out, the way her father would sit by the fire at night playing his fiddle, trying to make everyone forget how bad things were. And she remembered the things she wasn't supposed to notice, like the fact that her father couldn't keep a job, that every time he tried to settle down and work for someone else, he'd get restless and quit, that he'd rather chase another piece of land, another fresh start, than stick with something stable. She noticed the way her mother's face would go blank when Charles announced another move, the way Caroline would just nod and start packing without a word, because what else could she do? She noticed the other families they met on the road, families that looked just like them, worn down, broke, hopeful in a way that felt more like desperation than optimism. And she noticed the people they displaced, the indigenous families whose land was being carved up and sold to white settlers, the way her father and the other men would talk about opening up the territory as if it had been empty before they arrived. Even as a child, Laura knew that wasn't true. She saw the Osage camps. She heard the Osage voices. She watched them pack up and leave the land that had been promised to them. And she said nothing. Because what could a 7-year-old girl say? What power did she have? But she remembered, and decades later, when she sat down to write her books, she had a choice. She could tell the truth, or she could tell a story that people wanted to hear. She chose the story, not because she was a liar exactly, but because she was a survivor, and survivors know that sometimes the truth is too expensive to tell. Here's what Laura remembered about those years in Minnesota, the grasshoppers. It started in the summer of 1874. You're standing in that same wheat field, and the sky goes dark. Not with clouds, but with insects, millions of them. Grasshoppers, descending like a biblical plague. They land on everything, the wheat, the garden, the roof of your house. They cover the ground so thickly that you can't walk without stepping on them. And the sound they make, the crunch, the hum of their wings, it's the kind of sound that gets inside your head and stays there. Your father runs into the field trying to save the crop. He's waving his arms, shouting, but it doesn't matter. The grasshoppers eat everything, the wheat, the corn, the vegetables in your mother's garden, even the leaves off the trees. In 3 days, they've destroyed an entire year's worth of work, and then they leave. Just like that. The sky clears, the sun comes out, and you're standing in a field that looks like it's been burned. Your father doesn't say anything. He just stands there, staring at the empty stalks. Your mother goes inside and starts rationing what little food you have left, and you watch, you remember. This happened again in 1875, and again in 1876. 3 years in a row. Russasul. The grasshoppers came. 3 years in a row, families like yours lost everything. Some families left. Some families starved. Some families sent their children to live with relatives in the East because they couldn't feed them anymore. The Ingalls family stayed. Barely. They survived on credit, on help from neighbours, on odd jobs Charles picked up in town, on Caroline's sewing work, on the vegetables she managed to grow in the tiny garden plot the grasshoppers had somehow missed. And they survived on hope. Or maybe it was stubbornness. It's hard to tell the difference sometimes. Laura remembered this. She remembered the hunger. She remembered her mother boiling potatoes in water and calling it soup. She remembered her father coming home with nothing again and again because there was no work to be had. She remembered the day the church organised a prayer service, April 26, 1877. The governor himself had declared it a day of prayer, asking people to beg God to stop the grasshoppers. And you know what? The grasshoppers never came back. People said it was a miracle, that God had answered their prayers. Laura didn't write about what she really thought, but she was old enough by then to understand that miracles and coincidences sometimes look the same. Here's what really happened. The Rocky Mountain locust, the species responsible for those plagues, went extinct. Scientists now believe it was because farmers had, without realizing it, destroyed the insects' breeding grounds by ploughing up the river valleys where they laid their eggs. So it wasn't a miracle, it was an accident. But Laura's father believed it was a miracle. And when Laura wrote about it decades later, she let that belief stand. Because it made a better story, and that's what she was good at. Taking the raw, ugly truth of her childhood and shaping it into something people could read without flinching. She turned the hunger into a lesson about resilience. She turned the moves into adventures. She turned her father's failures into noble struggles against a harsh land. And she turned herself into a character. Not the real Laura, the one who was angry and scared and tired, but a Laura who was plucky and brave and optimistic. A Laura who learned lessons and grew stronger and never gave up. That Laura was easier to love, but she wasn't real. The real Laura remembered too much. She remembered the fear in her mother's eyes. She remembered the sound of her father's voice when he tried to convince them that next year would be better. She remembered the feeling of being hungry, not just for a day or a week, but for months. She remembered the shame of being poor, of wearing dresses that were too short because there was no money for new fabric, of going to school with holes in her shoes, of knowing that other families looked at them and saw failure. And she carried all of that with her all the way into old age. When she finally sat down to write the Little House books, she was 63 years old. She and her husband Almanzo were living on a small farm in Missouri. They were stable, finally, after decades of struggle. But she hadn't forgotten. She remembered everything, and she made a choice. She would write it all down. But she would write it in a way that made sense, that had meaning, that turned suffering into story. She would give people the childhood she wished she'd had, and in doing so she would create one of the most beloved series in American literature. But she would also bury the truth so deep that it would take historians decades to dig it back up. Tonight, we're doing that digging, and what we're finding? It's not pretty, but it's real. And Laura, wherever she is, probably knew we'd find it eventually. She was too smart not to. You're 10 years old, and you're watching your father hitch up the wagon again. He's smiling, talking about the next place like it's going to be paradise. Like this time, everything will be different. You've heard this speech before, so has your mother. But she doesn't say anything, she just starts packing. Charles Ingalls is one of the most beloved father figures in American literature. In the Little House books, he's Pa, strong, kind, resourceful, always there with a story or a song to make things better. He builds houses with his bare hands. He hunts to feed his family. He plays the fiddle and makes everyone feel safe, and all of that is true. He really did those things. But here's what Laura left out. He also failed. Constantly. Repeatedly. In ways that put his family in real danger. Charles Ingalls wasn't a bad man, but he was a restless man. And on the American frontier, restlessness could be just as dangerous as cruelty. Let's start with the facts. Charles was born in 1836 in New York. His family moved to Illinois when he was a child, and he grew up farming. He was strong, good-looking, charming. People liked him. In 1860, at the age of 24, he married Caroline Quiner. She was 21. She'd grown up poor. Her father had died in a shipwreck on Lake Michigan when she was 5, and her mother had struggled to raise 5 children alone. Caroline knew what it was like to go without. She knew how to make a little bit go a long way. She knew how to survive. And she was about to spend the next 30 years doing exactly that. Charles and Caroline settled in Wisconsin, in a little log cabin in the big woods. For a few years it looked like they might make it work. Charles farmed. Caroline kept house. They had 2 daughters, Mary and Laura. But Charles couldn't sit still. By 1868, he He was already talking about moving west, about claiming land in Kansas, about starting fresh. Caroline didn't want to go, but Charles was convinced, and in those days, the husband decided. So they went, and that's where the pattern started. Charles would find a piece of land, he'd build a house, he'd plant crops, or start a business, or take a job, and for a while, it would seem like things were working, and then something would go wrong. Maybe the crops would fail, maybe the job would fall through, maybe he'd get into debt, maybe he'd just get bored, and he'd start talking about the next place, the next opportunity. And they'd pack up the wagon and leave. This happened over and over again. Wisconsin to Kansas, Kansas back to Wisconsin, Wisconsin to Minnesota, Minnesota to Iowa, Iowa to Dakota Territory. By the time Laura was 15, she'd lived in more places than most adults live in a lifetime, and every single move was Charles's idea. Now, let's be fair, the frontier was hard. A lot of families moved around, a lot of men failed at farming or business and had to start over. But Charles wasn't just unlucky, he was impulsive. He made decisions without thinking them through. He chased dreams without considering the cost, and the cost was always paid by his family. Take the Kansas situation. Charles moved his family onto land that was legally owned by the Osage Nation. He knew, or should have known, that white settlers weren't supposed to be there. The federal government had made that clear, but he built a house anyway. He invested time and money and labour into a piece of land that he had no right to claim. And when the government finally enforced the treaty and told the settlers to leave, Charles lost everything. The house, the work, the time, and his family had to pack up and start over. Again. Or take the Minnesota years. Charles moved the family to Walnut Grove in 1874, right as the grasshopper plagues were starting. He bought land on credit, planted wheat, and then watched as the insects destroyed everything. He could have left. A lot of families did. But Charles stayed, convinced that next year would be better. It wasn't. The grasshoppers came back in 1875, and again in 1876. 3 years in a row, Charles lost his crops. 3 years in a row, his family went hungry. And what did he do? He borrowed more money. He took odd jobs. He kept trying. You could call that resilience, or you could call it stubbornness. It depends on your perspective. From Laura's perspective, as a child, her father was a hero. He never gave up. He always tried to provide. He made them feel safe even when things were falling apart. But from Caroline's perspective, Charles was the reason things kept falling apart in the first place. Because here's the thing, Caroline didn't want to move. She wanted stability. She wanted a home. She wanted her daughters to grow up in one place, go to one school, have friends they didn't have to leave behind. But Charles couldn't give her that, because he couldn't give it to himself. He had a vision of what his life should be. He should be a landowner, a successful farmer, a man of means. He should be able to provide for his family without having to work for someone else. And that vision kept him moving, kept him chasing, kept him failing. By the time he was 50, Charles Ingalls had tried farming in 4 states. He'd tried running a hotel. He'd tried working as a carpenter, a butcher, a day labourer. None of it stuck. And his family paid the price. Laura didn't write about this, not directly. In the books, Pa's always doing his best. He's always trying. He's always hopeful. But if you read between the lines, you can see the cracks. You can see the fear in Ma's face. The way she goes quiet when Pa talks about moving again. The way she rations food and mends clothes and makes do with less and less. You can see the exhaustion in Laura's voice when she describes yet another new town, yet another new house, yet another new start. And you can see the truth. Charles Ingalls wasn't a heroic pioneer. He was a man who couldn't sit still, and his restlessness cost his family dearly. But Laura couldn't say that. Not outright. Because to say that would be to admit that her childhood wasn't an adventure. It was a series of disasters held together by her mother's sheer determination. And that's not the story people wanted to read. So Laura rewrote it. She turned Charles into Pa. She turned his failures into noble struggles. She turned his restlessness into the pioneering spirit. And it worked. People loved Pa. They still do. But Pa wasn't real. Charles Ingalls was. And Charles Ingalls was a man who loved his family but couldn't stop chasing a dream that was always just out of reach. You're 12 years old, and you're standing in the general store in Walnut Grove, Minnesota. Your mother has sent you to buy flour, but when you get to the counter, the storekeeper shakes his head. Your family's credit is used up, he says. You'll have to pay cash. You don't have cash. Your family never has cash. You leave the store empty-handed, and you walk home trying to figure out how to tell your mother. Let's talk about money. Or more specifically, let's talk about the lack of it. The Ingalls family was poor. Not, we have to be careful with our budget, poor. Poor in the way that meant they sometimes didn't know where their next meal was coming from. And it wasn't because they didn't work hard. Carolyn worked harder than most women could imagine. She cooked, cleaned, sewed, gardened, took in laundry, and raised 4 daughters. She did all of this while moving from place to place, often living in structures that barely qualified as houses. Charles worked hard too. He farmed, he hunted, he took whatever jobs he could find. But hard work doesn't always equal success, especially not on the frontier. Here's what Charles was up against: the cost of land. Even though the government was giving away land through the Homestead Act, it wasn't really free. You had to pay filing fees. You had to build a house and farm the land for 5 years before you actually owned it. You had to buy tools, seed, livestock. Most homesteaders went into debt before they even started. The cost of failure. If your crops failed, because of drought or grasshoppers or early frost, or any of the 100 other things that could go wrong, you still owed money. To the bank, to the general store, to your neighbours. The cost of moving. Every time Charles moved the family, it cost money. Selling land usually meant selling at a loss. Buying new land meant new debt. Moving itself, the wagon, the supplies, the time spent not working was expensive. Charles was constantly in debt, constantly borrowing, and constantly trying to get ahead and never quite making it. And every time he failed, the family fell a little further behind. Take the Minnesota years. Charles bought land in Walnut Grove in 1874. He borrowed money to do it. He planted wheat. And then the grasshoppers came. In one summer, Charles lost an entire year's worth of income. But he still owed money on the land. He still had to feed his family. He still had to pay the general store for supplies, so he borrowed more money. And when the grasshoppers came back the next year, he borrowed even more. By 1876, Charles was so deep in debt that he couldn't see a way out. So he did what he always did. He left. He didn't sell the land because he couldn't. Nobody wanted to buy land that had been destroyed by grasshoppers, so he just walked away from it, and the debt. And some of it followed him. Some of it he probably never paid off. This is what Laura didn't write about. She didn't write about the shame of being the family that couldn't pay their bills. She didn't write about the awkward conversations with storekeepers who wouldn't extend credit anymore. She didn't write about the way people looked at them when they showed up in a new town, another family of broke homesteaders trying to make it work. But she remembered it. She remembered the sound of her parents arguing in low voices late at night, thinking the children were asleep. She remembered her mother's face when Charles announced they were moving again, the way Caroline would just nod and start packing without asking where they were going or how they'd pay for it. She remembered the feeling of wearing a dress that was too small because there was no money for new fabric. She remembered being hungry, not just a little hungry, the way you get before dinner, but hungry in the way that makes your stomach hurt and your head feel light and your thoughts slow down. And she remembered that it didn't have to be this way, because there were other families in Walnut Grove who made it. Families who didn't lose everything. Families who stayed in one place and built something that lasted. What was the difference between those families and the Ingalls? It wasn't hard work, it wasn't faith, it wasn't determination. It was Charles. Charles was the difference. Because Charles couldn't stop chasing the next opportunity. He couldn't settle for being a hired hand or a shopkeeper or anything that might have provided steady income. He wanted to be a landowner, a farmer, a man who answered to no one. And that pride, That refusal to take the safer, steadier path kept his family poor. Caroline knew this. She had to. But what could she do? She couldn't leave. She had 4 daughters and no money and nowhere to go. So she stayed. And she made do. And she kept the family together through sheer force of will. And Laura watched all of this. She watched her mother perform miracles with almost nothing. She watched her father's optimism turn into disappointment, again and again. And she learned something crucial, that stories matter more than facts, because the facts were ugly. The facts were that her father failed repeatedly, and that his failures hurt his family. But the story Laura would later tell, was that her father tried his best, and that sometimes life is just hard, and that the important thing is to keep going. And you know what? That story's true too, in its own way. Charles did try his best. He loved his family. He wanted to provide for them. He just didn't know how. And maybe that's the saddest part of all. Because if Charles had been willing to give up his dreams, to take a steady job, to stay in one place, to stop chasing the next big opportunity, his family would have been better off. But he couldn't do it. And so they kept moving, kept struggling, kept failing. Until Laura was old enough to leave, to make her own life, to marry a man who unfortunately turned out to be just as unlucky as her father. But that's a story for later. For now, just understand this. The Little House books are built on a foundation of economic failure, and Laura knew it. She just decided to build something beautiful on top of it. You're 14 years old, and your father has just announced that the family is moving. Again. This time, it's to Dakota Territory. He's going to work for the railroad, he says. It's a sure thing, he says. This time, everything will be different. You don't believe him anymore. By the time Laura was a teenager, she'd figured out the pattern. Her father would get excited about a new opportunity. He'd convince himself and try to convince everyone else that this time it would work, and then it wouldn't, and they'd move again. Dakota Territory was supposed to be the fresh start to end all fresh starts. Charles had a job lined up with the railroad company. The family would live in a railroad camp while he worked, and then they'd file a claim on land nearby. It was all planned out. For once, it seemed like Charles had made a smart, practical decision, but of course, it didn't go as planned. The job was hard, the pay was low, the living conditions were brutal. The family lived in a rough shanty, essentially a glorified shack, through a Dakota winter. If you've never experienced a Dakota winter, let me tell you, it's the kind of cold that gets inside your bones and stays there. The kind of cold where your breath freezes in the air, and your eyelashes stick together, and the wind cuts through every layer of clothing you're wearing. The Ingalls family nearly froze to death that winter, but Charles was determined. He kept working. And he kept believing that this was the right move, and eventually he filed a homestead claim. He built a house, not a shanty this time, but a real house, on the land. And for a while, it looked like maybe, finally, Charles had found a place to stay. But even then, even when the family had a house and a piece of land and a chance at stability, Charles couldn't quite commit to it. He kept taking side jobs. He kept looking for other opportunities. He kept moving between the homestead and town, never quite settling in one place. And Laura watched. And she learned. She learned that her father's restlessness wasn't just about circumstances. It wasn't just about bad luck or hard times. It was part of who he was. He was a man who needed to be moving, who needed to believe that the next place, the next opportunity, the next dream would be the one that finally worked. And that need, that hunger for something better, something more, was stronger than his love for stability, stronger even than his love for his family. That sounds harsh, but it's true, because if Charles had truly put his family first, he would have stopped moving. He would have taken a steady job even if it wasn't glamorous. He would have stayed in one place even if it wasn't perfect. But he didn't, and his family paid the price. Laura didn't write about this in the books. She couldn't. Because to write about it would be to admit that her father's dreams were more important to him than her mother's needs, than her own needs. and that admission would have broken the myth she was trying to create. So instead, she wrote about Pa's wanderlust as something noble, as part of the pioneering spirit, as a trait to admire. But the truth is more complicated. Charles Ingalls was a good man in many ways. He was kind, he was loving, he tried to protect his family, but he was also selfish. He prioritized his own needs, his need to keep moving, to keep trying, to keep chasing the dream, over the stability his family desperately needed. And that selfishness had consequences. It meant that his daughters grew up without a real home, without lasting friendships, without the security that comes from knowing where you'll be next year. It meant that his wife spent her entire adult life following a man who couldn't stop running. And it meant that when Laura finally grew up and got married, she chose a man just like her father. A man with big dreams and bad luck. A man who tried and failed and tried again. A man who would keep her poor for most of her life, because that's what Laura knew, that's what felt normal to her, and it would take her decades to break free from that pattern. But we'll get to that. For now, just understand this. Charles Ingalls wasn't the hero Pa from the books. He was a man with a restless heart, and that restlessness shaped Laura's entire life, for better and for worse. You're 5 years old, and you wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of your mother crying. It's not loud. It's the kind of crying that someone does when they're trying not to be heard. The kind that catches in the throat and comes out in small, broken sounds. You don't move, you pretend to be asleep. Because even at 5, you understand that this is something private, something your mother wouldn't want you to see. In the morning she's calm. She makes breakfast. She braids your hair. She smiles at your father when he comes in from the barn, and you never mention what you heard. Caroline Lake Quiner Ingalls is the forgotten woman in the Little House story. Everyone knows Laura. Everyone loves Pa. But Ma is just there. The quiet, steady presence in the background. The one who keeps the house clean and the children fed and everything running smoothly. In the books, Ma is almost saintly. She never complains. She never loses her temper. She's patient and kind and always, always proper. But that version of Ma isn't real. The real Caroline was a woman who survived things that would have broken most people. She buried loved ones. She followed a man whose dreams kept dragging her family into poverty. She raised 4 daughters in conditions that were, by any measure, brutal. And she did it all without ever being asked if it was what she wanted. Let's start at the beginning. Caroline Quiner was born in 1839 in Wisconsin. Her father, Henry Quiner, was a sailor on the Great Lakes. When Caroline was 5 years old, he died in a shipwreck. Her mother, Charlotte, was left alone with 5 children and almost no money. Charlotte did what she had to do. She took in sewing. She remarried, a man who could provide for the family even if he wasn't particularly warm. She made sure her children survived. And Caroline learned early what survival looked like. It looked like doing whatever needed to be done, without complaint. It looked like making a little bit stretch as far as possible. It looked like keeping your feelings to yourself, because nobody had time for feelings when there was work to do. Caroline grew up fast. By the time she was a teenager, she was helping to raise her younger siblings. She was cooking, cleaning, sewing. She was learning how to be the kind of woman who could hold a household together. And then, when she was 21, she met Charles Ingalls. Charles was charming. He was handsome. He had big dreams and an easy smile. He made her feel like life could be more than just surviving. So she married him, and for the rest of her life she would regret it. Not because she didn't love him, but because she realized, slowly, that Charles's dreams would always come first. When Charles decided to move from Wisconsin to Kansas, Caroline didn't want to go. She had family in Wisconsin. She had a community. She had a life that, while hard, was stable. But Charles was convinced that Kansas was the answer, and in those days a wife didn't have much say in the matter. So Caroline packed up her children, Mary, just a toddler, and baby Laura, and she climbed into a covered wagon and left everything she knew behind. And that was just the beginning. Over the next 2 decades, Caroline would move more times than she could count. She would live in log cabins, claim shanties, dugouts, and rough frame houses. She would give birth to 4 daughters in 4 different states. She would bury a baby boy in Minnesota. and through all of it, she would hold her family together. Not because she wanted to, but because she had no other choice. Here's what Caroline's daily life looked like. She woke up before dawn. She built a fire, hauled water, made breakfast. She cooked every meal from scratch, often with very little to work with. She baked bread. She churned butter. She preserved food for winter. She washed clothes by hand, hauling water, heating it, scrubbing each piece, wringing it out, hanging it to dry. In winter, the clothes would freeze on the line and she'd have to bring them inside stiff as boards. She sewed every piece of clothing her family wore. She mended the same dresses over and over, letting out hems as the girls grew, patching holes, making do with what she had. She taught her daughters to read and write, because there wasn't always a school nearby. She gardened, she canned, she made soap and candles. She did all of this while pregnant or nursing or recovering from childbirth. She did all of this while moving from place to place, never knowing if they'd be in the same house 6 months from now. She did all of this while her husband chased dream after dream, failure after failure, and she never complained, at least not in a way that anyone recorded. Because here's the thing, Caroline didn't have the luxury of complaining. If she fell apart, the family fell apart. If she gave up, her daughters would go hungry. So she didn't give up. She got up every morning and she did the work, and she taught her daughters to do the same, but that doesn't mean she was happy. Laura, writing decades later, would describe Ma as calm and patient and strong, and she was those things, but she was also exhausted and angry and afraid. Laura hints at this in small ways. The way Ma goes quiet when Pa talks about moving, the way Ma's mouth tightens when there's not enough food, the way Ma insists on keeping the house clean and the girls properly dressed even when it seems pointless. Those weren't just quirks, they were survival mechanisms. Caroline couldn't control where they lived. She couldn't control whether the crops failed or the money ran out. But she could control her house. She could control her daughter's behaviour. She could maintain standards even when everything else was falling apart. And that's how she survived. By holding on to the thing she could control and letting go of the thing she couldn't. But that didn't make it easier. It didn't make it hurt less when Charles announced another move. It didn't make it less terrifying when the food ran low. It didn't make it less exhausting to do the same backbreaking work day after day, with no end in sight. Caroline was strong, but she was also human, and Laura knew that. She saw her mother's strength, but she also saw the cost of it. She saw the way her mother's hands were always rough and red from work, the way her face was lined before she was 40, the way she moved slowly, carefully, like someone whose body had been used up. And Laura understood, even as a child, that her mother had given up everything, her home, her family, her dreams, all to follow a man who couldn't sit still. But Laura couldn't write about that, not directly. Because to write about it would be to admit that the pioneer life wasn't romantic, that it wasn't an adventure, that it was, for women like her mother, a kind of slow, grinding sacrifice. And that wasn't the story people wanted to read. So Laura made Ma into a saint, a woman who never complained, never doubted, or else never regretted, but the real Caroline. She was a woman who cried in the middle of the night when she thought no one could hear, and then got up the next morning and did it all over again. You're 7 years old, and your mother is pregnant again. You don't understand why this makes you feel scared. You should be excited. A new baby means a new brother or sister, but instead, you feel a cold, tight knot in your stomach. Your mother is tired, more tired than usual. She moves slowly, her hand pressed against the small of her back. She doesn't smile as much, and then one day she's in bed, and she stays there, and the baby is born, and he dies. In 1876, Caroline gave birth to a son. His name was Charles Frederick Ingalls. He lived for 9 months. And then he died. Laura barely mentions this in the books. In Little House on the Prairie, there's a brief reference to baby Carrie, but the boy who came before Carrie, Charles Frederick, is almost entirely erased. Why? Because grief is hard to sell. Laura was writing for children. She was writing to entertain, to teach lessons, to create a sense of nostalgia. And a dead baby doesn't fit that narrative, but Caroline never forgot. She carried that loss with her for the rest of her life. Imagine it. You give birth to a son, you hold him, you feed him, you watch him grow for 9 months, and then he gets sick. Maybe it's a fever, maybe it's an infection, maybe it's something that in a city with a doctor nearby could have been treated, but you're not in a city. You're in a claim shanty in Minnesota, miles from the nearest town, and there's nothing you can do, so you watch your baby die. And then you bury him, and then you get up the next day and you keep going, because you have 3 other children who need you, and a husband who's already talking about the next move. Caroline didn't have time to grieve. Not properly. Not the way a mother should be allowed to grieve. She had to pack up the house. She had to take care of Mary and Laura and baby Carrie. She had to keep cooking and cleaning and sewing and all the other endless tasks that kept the family alive, and she had to do it all while carrying the weight of that loss. Laura saw this. She was old enough to understand that something terrible had happened. Old enough to see the way her mother's face changed, the way she went even quieter than usual. But Laura didn't write about it. Maybe because it hurt too much. Maybe because she didn't think readers would want to know. Maybe because by the time she was writing the books, she'd learned to bury her own painful memories. But the loss was real, and it shaped Caroline in ways that Laura couldn't, or wouldn't, articulate. Because after Charles Frederick died, something in Caroline hardened. She became more careful, more controlled, more insistent on rules and order and cleanliness. Not because she was naturally rigid, but because she'd learned that the world was dangerous, that you could lose everything in an instant, that the only way to survive was to hold tight to the things you could control. And so she did. She controlled her house. She controlled her daughter's behaviour. She controlled her own emotions. And she never let herself hope too much, because hope on the frontier, damned, was a luxury Caroline couldn't afford. You're 13 years old, and you're watching your mother teach Mary how to set a table properly. It seems ridiculous. You're living in a claim shanty in Dakota territory. You eat off tin plates. The table is a board laid across 2 crates. But your mother insists. The fork goes here, the knife goes there. You sit up straight. You don't talk with your mouth full. You don't understand why it matters. But it does. To her, it matters more than almost anything. Caroline's insistence on propriety, on manners and cleanliness and proper behaviour, wasn't about snobbery. It was about identity. Because here's what Caroline understood. The frontier stripped away everything. Your home, your community, your security, and if you let it, it would strip away your sense of self too. Caroline refused to let that happen. She might be living in a dugout. She might be wearing a dress that had been mended a dozen times. She might be cooking over an open fire and hauling water from a creek. But she would not let her daughters grow up wild. She would teach them to read and write, to sew and cook, to behave like ladies, because those were the things that made them different from the rough, uneducated families around them. Those were the things that said, we may be poor, but we are not defeated. And that distinction mattered to Caroline. It mattered more than comfort, more than convenience, more even than Charles's approval. Because Charles didn't care about those things. He didn't care if the girls ran around barefoot or if dinner was served on a proper table. He was focused on the next opportunity, the next move, the next dream. But Caroline cared, and in caring she staged a quiet rebellion. She couldn't stop Charles from moving the family. She couldn't change their financial situation. She couldn't protect her daughters from hunger or cold or loss. But she could teach them how to survive with dignity. She could show them that being poor didn't mean being less than. She could prove, every single day, that they were still a family, still people of value, still worth something. And Laura saw this. She understood, maybe not as a child, but later, as an adult, what her mother had been doing. Caroline wasn't just teaching manners, she was teaching survival. She was teaching her daughters that no matter how hard life got, no matter how much they lost, they would not lose themselves. And that lesson stuck. Laura carried it with her into adulthood, into her own marriage, into her own struggles. And when she finally sat down to write the Little House books, she made sure to include her mother's lessons. Not because they were quaint or old-fashioned, but because they were the things that had kept her family human. You're 63 years old, sitting at a desk in Missouri, and you're trying to remember what it felt like to be hungry. Not metaphorically hungry, not I missed lunch, hungry, but the kind of hungry that makes your stomach feel like it's eating itself. The kind that makes you dream about food and wake up disappointed. You remember. Of course you remember. You've spent your whole life trying to forget, and you remember everything. But here's the question. Do you write it down? Do you tell the children who'll read your books what it really felt like? Or do you make it softer, prettier, more palatable? You choose the lie, not because you're dishonest, but because the truth is too ugly to sell. This is 1930. The Great Depression has just begun. People are desperate for stories about simpler times, about families that worked hard and stuck together and made it through anything. They don't want to hear about a family that ran from debt, that squatted illegally on native land, that survived not because they were exceptional, but because they were stubborn and lucky. So you give them what they want. You give them Pa, who's strong and wise and always knows what to do. Not Charles, who moved his family 17 times in 30 years because he couldn't hold on to anything. You give them Ma, who's patient and calm and never loses faith. Not Caroline, who cried in the dark and buried a baby and followed a man whose dreams were bigger than his abilities. You give them a childhood that was hard but meaningful, not a childhood that was hard and pointless and shaped by forces you had no control over. And it works. The books sell, people love them. You become famous, but every word you write is a choice. Every scene is a negotiation between memory and myth. Let's talk about what you left out. You left out the racism. Oh, there's some in the published books, enough that modern readers cringe, but you softened it. In your first drafts, you were much more explicit about your father's attitudes toward Native Americans, about the things he said, the things he believed. Your daughter Rose and your editor made you tone it down, not because they were enlightened, but because they knew it would hurt sales. So you rewrote those sections. You made the Osage less threatening. You made your father seem more sympathetic to them. You turned fear into curiosity, hatred into misunderstanding. And the truth? The truth got buried. You left out the debts. In the books, your family is poor, yes, but it's noble poverty. The kind that comes from bad luck and hard times, not from your father's inability to manage money. You don't mention the creditors, the unpaid bills, the way your family would leave town in the middle of the night sometimes, owing money they'd never pay back. You don't mention the shame, the way other families looked at you, the way storekeepers would shake their heads when your mother tried to buy on credit. You turn it all into adventure, into the pioneering spirit, into something that sounds romantic instead of desperate. You left out the hunger. Oh, you mention it. You talk about times when food was scarce, but you make it sound temporary, like a challenge to overcome. You don't write about the months when there wasn't enough, when your mother would give you and Mary her portion and claim she wasn't hungry, when you'd go to bed with your stomach aching and wake up the same way. You don't write about the way hunger makes you think differently, makes everything harder, makes you tired and slow and angry. You make it sound like character-building hardship, not the grinding, degrading reality it actually was. And you leave out the biggest lie of all, that you wrote the books alone. Your daughter Rose was a successful writer. She'd published novels. She knew how books worked, how stories were structured, how dialogue should sound. And when you showed her your first manuscript, a rough rambling thing called Pioneer Girl, she tore it apart and rebuilt it. She invented scenes. She changed the chronology. She added dialogue you never spoke. She turned your memories into a narrative, and you let her, because you knew she was right. Your memories weren't enough. They needed to be shaped, polished, made into something that would sell. But here's the thing. Once Rose got involved, where do you end and she begins? Did you write the scene where Pa brings home Christmas candy? Or did Rose invent it to give the book a heartwarming moment? Did you really remember Ma saying those particular words? Or did Rose put them in your mouth because they sounded like something Ma would say? You don't know anymore, and maybe it doesn't matter. Because the books aren't really about truth. They're about story. They're about giving people a version of the past that makes sense, that has meaning, that teaches lessons. And if you have to lie a little to do that, Well, everyone lies about the past. You're just better at it than most. You're sitting at that desk and you're making choices. Every paragraph is a choice. Every scene is a negotiation between what really happened and what should have happened. And you choose the myth every single time, because the myth is what people need. The truth would just make them uncomfortable, and you didn't spend 60 years surviving just to make people uncomfortable. You survived to tell a story, and the story, it turns out, is more important than the facts. You're holding a letter from your daughter Rose and your hands are shaking, not because you're angry, but because she's right and you hate that she's right. The letter is full of notes about your manuscript. Whole pages crossed out, scenes rewritten, dialogue changed, characters removed entirely. She's taken your memories and turned them into something unrecognizable, and it's better. You can see that. It's tighter, more dramatic, more readable, but it's not what happened. Let's talk about Rose Wilder Lane. She was born in 1886 in Dakota Territory, during one of the hardest winters Laura ever experienced. She grew up watching her parents struggle, watching them fail, watching them barely survive. And she was smart. Smarter than Laura in some ways. She understood early that you couldn't just tell the truth and expect people to care. You had to make them care. You had to craft the truth into something compelling. Rose left home as soon as she could. She became a telegraph operator, then a reporter, then a novelist. She travelled the world. She lived in places Laura had never even dreamed of, and she became successful, more successful than her mother had ever been. So when Laura decided to write about her childhood, Rose seemed like the natural person to help. But help is a complicated word. Rose didn't just edit Laura's manuscripts, she rewrote them completely, from the ground up. Take Pioneer Girl. Laura's first attempt at writing her story. It was written for adults, not children. It was darker, more honest. It included things that Laura later cut. The baby brother who died, the family's illegal squatting, the real reasons they kept moving. Rose read it and said, "This won't sell." She was probably right. It was rambling. It jumped around chronologically. It didn't have a clear narrative arc. So Rose told Laura to rewrite it. For children this time. Make it simpler, make it warmer, make it into lessons. And Laura did. She wrote Little House in the Big Woods, a cozy story about life in Wisconsin. Safe, nostalgic, perfect for children. She sent it to Rose, and Rose rewrote it. She didn't just edit it. She restructured it. She invented dialogue. She added scenes that Laura had never mentioned. She changed the pacing, the tone, the very voice of the narrative, and when the book was published it had both their names in the copyright, but only Laura's on the cover. This pattern continued for every single book in the series. Laura would write a draft. Rose would tear it apart and rebuild it. Laura would revise. Rose would revise again, back and forth, until neither of them could quite remember whose words were whose. And here's where it gets complicated. Rose believed she deserved more credit. She believed she was the real author, and Laura was just providing the raw material. Laura believed she was the author, and Rose was just helping polish her memories. The truth? It's somewhere in between. Laura had the memories, the experiences, the emotional truth of the story. But Rose had the craft, the skill, the ability to turn those memories into something people would actually want to read. Without Laura, there would be no story. Without Rose, the story would have died in a drawer somewhere, unread and unpublished. So who wrote the Little House books? Both of them, and neither of them. They wrote them together, in a collaboration that was sometimes supportive and sometimes bitter, and always complicated. And the books that resulted, they're not Laura's memories, and they're not Rose's inventions. They're something else entirely, a hybrid, a myth built on a foundation of truth and shaped by the needs of the marketplace. Let's talk about specific examples. In Little House on the Prairie, there's a famous scene where Pa encounters a wolf pack on his way home from town. He's surrounded by wolves, but he stands his ground and they eventually leave him alone. Did that really happen? Laura says yes. She says she remembered her father telling that story, but historians have checked. There were no wolf packs in that area at that time. The wolves had been hunted out years earlier, so either Charles made up the story to entertain his daughters, or Laura remembered it wrong, or Rose invented it to add drama. We'll never know. Or take the character of Mr. Edwards in Little House on the Prairie, the funny bachelor neighbour who becomes a friend to the Ingalls family. Did he exist? Sort of. There was a man named Edmund Mason who lived near the Ingalls family in Kansas. Well, but he wasn't the jovial Santa Claus meeting bachelor from the books. He was a married man with children. Laura, or Rose, changed him, made him more colourful, more memorable, more useful to the story. And in doing so, they erased the real Edmund Mason and replaced him with a fiction. This happened again and again throughout the series. Real people became composite characters. Real events got moved around in time. Real conversations were invented from whole cloth. And Laura knew this was happening. She participated in it. She agreed to it. Because she understood something crucial. Memory is already a kind of fiction. You remember what fits your narrative. You forget what doesn't. So if you're going to write about the past, you might as well shape it into something useful. But here's what that means. The Laura Ingalls Wilder in the books is not the real Laura. She's a character, crafted, invented. Based on a real person, yes, but fundamentally fictional. The real Laura was angrier, more complicated, less patient, more sharp-tongued. The real Laura remembered grudges, held onto resentments, had opinions about people that weren't always kind. But that Laura wouldn't have sold books. So Rose and Laura together created a different Laura. A Laura who was plucky and brave and optimistic. A Laura who learned lessons and grew as a person. A Laura who was easier to love. And in doing so, they buried the real woman so deep that even now, decades later, we're still trying to dig her out. You're 12 years old, and you're watching your father argue with a man in town. You don't understand what they're saying exactly. Something about money, something about debt, something about promises your father made and couldn't keep. The man is angry. Your father is defensive. Your mother is standing very still, her face blank. And you? You're learning something important. You're learning that your father's word doesn't mean as much as he thinks it does. This scene isn't in the books. None of the scenes like it are in the books, because admitting that your father couldn't be trusted with money would ruin the myth of Pa. The capable, reliable, trustworthy Pa who always did his best for his family. But the truth is more complicated. Charles Ingalls was a bad businessman. He bought land he couldn't afford. He borrowed money he couldn't pay back. He made promises he couldn't keep. And Laura knew it. She watched it happen, over and over. But she never wrote about it. Here's what else she never wrote about. She never wrote about the time the family left Walnut Grove in the middle of the night, owing money to half the town. She never wrote about the creditors who came looking for Charles. She never wrote about the way her mother would make excuses when people asked when they'd be paid back. She never wrote about the fights. Oh, she mentions disagreements, but she never writes about the real fights. The ones where voices were raised, where doors were slammed, where her mother went silent for days because she was so angry she couldn't speak. She never wrote about Mary's real feelings about going blind. In the books, Mary is patient, accepting, almost saintly about her blindness. But the real Mary? She was 15 years old when she lost her sight. She was angry, she was grieving. She didn't want to be the patient, accepting blind girl everyone expected her to be. But Laura wrote her that way anyway, because that's the story people wanted. She never wrote about the time she hated her life, the time she wanted to run away, the time she looked at her mother's worn-out face and her father's empty promises and thought, I will never let this happen to me, and then married a man exactly like her father. She never wrote about the way the frontier actually worked, about how most homesteaders failed, about how the land was being stolen from native people, about how the whole system was built on violence and dispossession. She wrote about it as if it was empty land, waiting to be claimed, as if her family had as much right to be there as anyone. But she knew better. She'd seen the Osage families being forced out. She'd heard the soldiers talking. She'd watched the whole ugly process unfold. And she said nothing. Because to say something would be to admit that her family's survival was built on other people's suffering. And that's not a story you can tell to children. She never wrote about what it cost her mother. The real cost, not just the physical exhaustion, though that was real, but the emotional cost. The cost of following a man who couldn't stop moving. The cost of burying a child. The cost of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Carolyn died in 1924. Laura was 57. She'd been married for 37 years. She'd lived through her own failures and struggles. And when her mother died, Laura started writing. Why then? Why not earlier? Maybe because her mother's death freed her. Not from grief, but from the obligation to protect Caroline's image, to make her mother's choices seem reasonable. Now Laura could tell the story her way. She could reshape the past. She could turn all that suffering into something that made sense. But even then, even with that freedom, she couldn't tell the whole truth, because the whole truth was too ugly, too sad, too honest. So she told a story instead. A story about a family that worked hard and stuck together and survived. A story about a father who tried his best and a mother who never gave up, and children who learned important lessons. A story that was true enough to feel real, but false enough to be comforting. And that story became the Little House books, and millions of people loved them, and Laura became famous, and the truth stayed buried. Until now. Because we're digging it up. We're asking the uncomfortable questions. We're looking at the census records and the land claims and the newspaper articles, and we're finding the gaps, the lies, the convenient omissions, and we're realizing that the story Laura told us was beautiful, but it wasn't true. Not entirely. And maybe that's okay. Maybe all stories are lies in some way. Maybe the truth is too complicated to fit into a narrative, but it's important to know the difference between the story and the truth, between Laura the character and Laura the woman, between the myth and the reality, because the myth is powerful. The myth has shaped how generations of Americans think about the frontier, about family, about resilience. But the reality is messier, more human, more complicated, and maybe, just maybe, more worth knowing. You're 18 years old, and there's a man looking at you. Not the way boys look at girls they want to tease or impress, but the way someone looks at something they're trying to figure out. Like you're a puzzle he's deciding whether to solve. His name is Almanzo Wilder. He's 25. He's a farmer. He has a homestead claim just outside of town, and he's interested. You should be flattered. Most girls your age are already married or at least promised to someone. But you've been too busy working, too busy helping support your family after Mary went blind, and you've been careful. Because you've watched your mother. You've seen what it means to marry a man whose dreams are bigger than his abilities. You told yourself you'd never do that, and then you meet Almanzo, and he reminds you of your father, and you marry him anyway. Let's talk about Almanzo James Wilder. He was born in 1857 in New York, the youngest son of a prosperous farming family. His father, James Wilder, was successful, really successful. He owned good land. He knew how to manage money. He raised his children to understand farming as a business, not just a way of life. Almanzo grew up with advantages Charles Ingalls never had. He had training, resources, a family network. And when he came west to Dakota Territory, he came with money in his pocket and skills in his head. He seemed like a good bet. He seemed like the kind of man who could provide stability, who could give Laura the life her father had always promised but never delivered. But there was a problem. Almanzo had the same restless streak as Charles, the same belief that the next opportunity would be the big one, the same inability to be satisfied with what he had. He just hid it better. When Laura met him, Almanzo was doing well. He had a homestead claim. He was building a house. He had horses, good ones, and he knew how to handle them. He was confident, capable, different from the other young men in town who were just scraping by. Laura was teaching school at the time, living away from home, lonely. Almanzo would drive her back to her family's claim on weekends. They'd talk, they'd get to know each other, and Laura made a choice. She chose the man who reminded her of her father, not consciously. She probably didn't think of it that way. But she chose a man who had big dreams, who was always planning the next move, who believed he could make a success out of farming in a place where most farmers failed. She chose a man who was optimistic to the point of recklessness. She chose a man who would spend the next 40 years proving that optimism wrong. They married in August 1885. Laura was 18, Almanzo was 28. It was a small wedding. No fancy dress, no big celebration. Just a simple ceremony and then back to work. Because there was always work to be done. Almanzo had built a house on his claim. Not a cabin, but an actual house. 2 stories, multiple rooms. It must have seemed like a palace to Laura, who'd grown up in dugouts and shanties. For a brief moment it looked like maybe Laura had chosen well. Maybe she'd found a man who could actually deliver on his promises, but then the disaster started. First, there was the drought. 1886, the crops failed. The wheat that Almanzo had planted, the wheat that was supposed to pay off his debts and set them up for the future, withered in the fields. Then there was the fire. A prairie fire swept through their land, destroying hay and pasture. Then the hail, a storm that lasted minutes but destroyed what little was left of their crops. And then, just when they thought things couldn't get worse, there was the winter. The winter of 1886 to 87 was brutal, bitterly cold. And Almanzo, trying to keep up with the work, spent hours outside in that cold. He got sick, very sick. He survived, but he was never quite the same. Whatever illness he had, probably diphtheria, left him weakened. He tired easily. He couldn't do the heavy work he used to do, and the farm started to fail. Just like Charles's farms had failed. Just like all those dreams Laura had watched her father chase and lose. It was happening again, and Laura was living it. Again. You're 22 years old, and you're sitting in a house that's falling apart. Not metaphorically, literally falling apart. There's a crack in the foundation. The roof leaks. The windows don't close properly, and you don't have money to fix any of it. Your husband is outside trying to work a field that won't produce anything. He's moving slowly like an old man, even though he's only 30. Your baby daughter is crying. She's hungry. Yeah, you're all hungry, and you're thinking, this is exactly what I swore would never happen to me. The late 1880s and early 1890s were the worst years of Laura and Almanzo's life. Everything went wrong. Not one or two things. Everything. The crops failed. Year after year. Drought, hail, fire, early frost. Every disaster that could hit a farmer hit them. Almanzo's health never fully recovered. He tried to keep working, but he couldn't do what he used to do. He hired help, which cost money they didn't have. They borrowed money from banks, from family, from anyone who would lend to them, and they sank deeper and deeper into debt. In 1889, their house caught fire. Not a prairie fire this time, their actual house. The one Almanzo had built. The one that was supposed to be their future. They saved most of their belongings, but the house was badly damaged. They moved into a smaller claim shanty while they tried to figure out what to do, and then their son died. They'd had a baby boy, born in August, 1889. Laura doesn't write about him much in her autobiographical work. She barely mentions him at all. But he existed, and he died, just a few weeks old. The same thing that had happened to Laura's mother, losing a baby boy, happened to Laura. And just like her mother, Laura got up the next day and kept going, because what else could she do? In 1890, Almanzo had a stroke. He was only 33 years old, but the combination of illness, overwork and stress had broken his body. He survived. But he was partially paralysed for a time. His legs were weak. He needed a cane to walk. And Laura had to take over more and more of the work. She was 23 years old. She had a young daughter, Rose. Her husband was an invalid. They were drowning in debt. The farm was failing, and she had a choice to make. She could leave. Take Rose and go back to her parents. Admit that the marriage was a mistake. Or she could stay and fight. She chose to stay. Not because she loved Almanzo so much she couldn't bear to leave him, but because leaving would mean admitting defeat. It would mean becoming her mother, a woman who had no choice but to follow a failing man. At least if she stayed, she could fight. She could try to change things, so she fought. She took over the farm work, she planted, she harvested, she did the work Almanzo couldn't do anymore. She took in sewing, she took in borders. She did whatever she could to bring in money, and slowly, painfully, they started to dig themselves out. But it wasn't enough. By 1894, they'd lost everything. The land, the house, everything they'd built. They had to start over. Again. Just like Laura's father had done. Over and over and over. And Laura understood, with a clarity that must have been devastating, that she had married her father. Almanzo wasn't a bad man. He worked hard. He loved his family. He tried. But he had the same fatal flaw as Charles. He couldn't hold on to anything. He couldn't turn hard work into lasting success. And Laura, who had spent her childhood watching her father fail, was now spending her adulthood watching her husband fail. The irony must have been unbearable. You're 27 years old, and you're packing up a wagon. Again. You swore you'd never do this. You swore you'd never be the woman in the wagon, leaving everything behind, heading to some new place with nothing but hope and stubbornness. But here you are, because the farm in Dakota is gone, the debts are too high, Almanzo's health is too poor, the climate is too harsh. So you're leaving. You're going to Missouri, to a place called Mansfield. Your father-in-law has given you a little bit of money, enough to buy some land, enough to start over. One more time. In 1894, Laura, Almanzo, and 7-year-old Rose packed up everything they owned and left Dakota Territory. They were done with the frontier, done with homesteading, done with trying to make a living off land that didn't want to give. They headed south to the Ozarks, where the climate was milder and the land was cheaper. They bought 40 acres outside of Mansfield, Missouri. Rough land, covered in rocks and trees. Not the flat, endless prairie they were used to, but it was theirs. They called it Rocky Ridge Farm, and for the first time in their married life they started to build something that would last. But it didn't happen quickly, and it didn't happen easily. They started with almost nothing. A small log cabin, some chickens, a cow, a few tools. Almanzo's health was still poor. He couldn't do heavy work, so Laura did it. She cleared land, she built fences, she planted orchards, she raised chickens and sold eggs. She did the work of 2 people, and slowly, over years, Rocky Ridge Farm became something real. They built a house, a real one, with Laura's money. Money she'd earned herself. They planted apple trees, hundreds of them. And after years of waiting, those trees started producing. They kept expanding, buying more land, building more structures, creating a farm that actually worked. And for the first time in Laura's life, she had stability. She was 40 years old by the time Rocky Ridge Farm was truly successful. 40 years old before she had a home that wasn't temporary. 40 years of struggling, of moving, of failing and starting over. And the whole time she remembered. She remembered every house they'd left, every debt they'd run from, every promise that hadn't been kept. She remembered her father, her mother, her own failures and losses, and she started to think, maybe I should write this down, not as therapy, not as confession, but as a way to make sense of it all, to turn all that suffering into something that meant something. So she did. She started writing. Essays at first, for local papers, about farm life, about the past, and people liked them. They liked her voice, her perspective, her way of making hard things sound manageable, and Laura realised, this is it. This is what I'm good at. Not farming, not homesteading, not following a man from one failed dream to another, but writing, taking the raw, ugly truth of her life and shaping it into something people wanted to read. So she kept writing, and eventually, with Rose's help, she turned those memories into books. Books that would make her famous. Books that would rewrite her own history. Books that would bury the truth so deep that we're still digging for it today. But that success, that came late, very late. Laura was 64 when the first Little House book was published. 64 years old, after a lifetime of struggle. After 40 years of marriage to a man who, like her father, could never quite make his dreams come true. But in the end, Laura succeeded where both of them failed. She created something that lasted. Not a farm, not a homestead, not a piece of land, but a story that would outlive her, that would shape how millions of people understood the past, and all it cost her was the truth. You're 64 years old, standing in a post office in Mansfield, Missouri, and you're holding a package. It's heavy, rectangular. You know what's inside before you open it. Your book, your first published book. Little house in the big woods. Your hands are shaking, not from age, from the sheer weight of what this means. You've spent 64 years struggling, surviving, watching dreams die. And now, finally, you're holding something that worked, something that lasted. Laura Ingalls Wilder became a published author in 1932. She was 64 years old. Most writers dream of success in their 20s or 30s, of making their mark while they're still young enough to enjoy it. Laura didn't get that. She got decades of failure first, decades of watching her father fail, watching her husband fail, failing herself. And then, when most people are thinking about retirement, she became famous. The timing wasn't accidental. It was 1932. The Great Depression was at its worst. People were desperate, hungry, homeless, scared. And they wanted stories that told them that hard times could be survived, that families who stuck together and worked hard could make it through anything. Laura's book gave them that. It told them about a family in the big woods of Wisconsin, a family that had very little but had each other, a family that made their own fun, their own food, their own everything, a family that was happy despite the hardship. It was exactly what people needed to hear, and the book sold. Not millions of copies overnight, but it sold steadily. People bought it. They read it to their children. They recommended it to their friends. And Laura's publisher asked for another book, so she wrote one. Farmer Boy, about Almanzo's childhood in New York. Then Little House on the Prairie. Then On the Banks of Plum Creek. Book after book, year after year, Laura chronicled her family's journey across the Midwest. And with each book, her fame grew. By the time she was 70, Laura Ingalls Wilder was a household name. Children across America knew her stories. Teachers used her books in classrooms, libraries couldn't keep them on the shelves, and Laura, who had spent most of her life in poverty, finally had money. Not a fortune, but enough to be comfortable, enough to not worry about where the next meal was coming from, enough to look back on 64 years of struggle and think it was worth it. But was it? The books made her famous, but they also trapped her. Because once the books were published, Laura became Laura Ingalls Wilder. Not the real woman, but the character. The little girl from the books now grown up. People expected her to be that person. Sweet, optimistic, full of pioneer spirit. And Laura played the part. In interviews, in letters to fans, in public appearances. She was charming, gracious. She told stories about the old days and made them sound wonderful. But in private, she was tired. She was tired of pretending, tired of the letters from children asking if Pa really played the fiddle, or if Ma really made the best bread. Tired of smiling and nodding and confirming the myth, because the myth had taken over. The books weren't just books anymore. They were the truth, the official version of the past, and Laura was stuck with it. She couldn't say, actually, Massa, my father couldn't hold on to land and my mother cried herself to sleep, and I married a man who failed just as much as my father did. She couldn't say, the books are partly fiction, my daughter rewrote them. We invented scenes and changed characters and made it all prettier than it was. She couldn't say any of that, because people didn't want to hear it. They wanted the myth, and Laura, finally successful after a lifetime of failure, wasn't about to destroy what she'd built. So she kept quiet. She kept playing the part, and the real Laura, angry, complicated, sharp-tongued Laura, stayed buried. You're 70 years old, and you're reading another letter from Rose. She's angry. Again. This time it's about money, about credit, about the fact that your name is on the covers of books that she claims she wrote. You're tired of this fight. You've been having it for years, but Rose won't let it go. As the Little House books became more successful, Rose Wilder Lane became more bitter. She believed, truly believed, that she was the real author, that Laura had just provided the raw material, and Rose had done the actual work of turning it into literature. And she had a point. Rose had restructured the books. She'd rewritten entire sections. She'd invented dialogue and scenes. She'd shaped the narrative arc. Without Rose, the books would have been rougher, less polished, possibly unpublishable. But here's the thing. Without Laura, there would have been no books at all. The memories were Laura's. The experiences were Laura's. The emotional core of the story was Laura's. Rose provided the craft, but Laura provided the heart. And the publishers decided that Laura's name should be on the covers, not Rose's. Laura Ingalls Wilder sounded like an authentic pioneer. Rose Wilder Lane sounded like a professional writer, which she was. But authenticity sold better than professionalism. So the books carried Laura's name alone. And Rose seethed. She wrote bitter letters to Laura. She complained to friends. She tried, repeatedly, to get more credit, more money, more recognition. But the publishers weren't interested. To them, Laura was the author. Rose was just the editor, and there was nothing Rose could do about it. This caused a rift between mother and daughter, not a complete break. They still wrote to each other, still saw each other occasionally, but there was tension, always. Rose felt used. She felt like she'd done the hard work and Laura had gotten all the glory. Laura felt defensive. She knew Rose had helped, but she also knew the stories were hers, her childhood, her memories, her pain. And neither of them could fully admit the truth, that the books were a collaboration, and trying to separate whose words were whose was impossible. The copyright situation made things worse. When Laura died in 1957, the copyrights to the Little House books passed to Rose, and Rose, finally in control, started making changes. She revised some of the later books. She made editorial decisions about reprints and new editions. She tried to shape the legacy. And she continued to insist to anyone who would listen that she was the real author. But by then it didn't matter. Laura was famous. Laura was beloved. Laura was the name everyone knew. Rose was just a footnote, and that must have been unbearable. To have done so much work, to have shaped books that millions of people loved, and to get so little recognition for it. To watch your mother become famous while you stayed in the shadows. To know that history would remember her name, not yours. That's the real tragedy of Rose Wilder Lane. Not that she didn't contribute, but that her contribution was erased, just like so many other women's contributions have been erased throughout history. Rose died in 1968, 11 years after Laura, and even in her obituary she was identified primarily as Laura Ingalls Wilder's daughter, not as a successful novelist in her own right, not as a journalist or political writer, not as the woman who shaped one of the most beloved series in American literature, just as Laura's daughter. You're 90 years old, and you're sitting on the porch of the farmhouse at Rocky Ridge. Your publisher has just sent you the sales figures for the Little House books. Millions of copies. Millions. You try to wrap your mind around that number. Millions of children reading about your childhood. Millions of families who think they know you, but they don't know you. They know the character. They know the myth. Laura Ingalls. Wilder died on February 10th, 1957, 3 days after her 90th birthday. She'd lived long enough to see the Little House books become a phenomenon, long enough to know that her work would outlive her. But she didn't live to see what would happen next. And she didn't see the television series, which premiered in 1974 and ran for 9 seasons, a show that took her books and changed them even more, that added characters and plot lines and turned the stories into something she probably wouldn't have recognised. She didn't see her books translated into dozens of languages, didn't see children in Japan and Germany and France reading about life on the American frontier. She didn't see the museums, the historic sites, the Laura Ingalls Wilder fan clubs, the academic conferences dedicated to studying her work. She didn't see herself become an industry, and she didn't see the backlash, because eventually people started asking uncomfortable questions. They started noticing the racism in the books, the way Native Americans were portrayed as threats or obstacles, the way the narrative treated white settlement as natural and inevitable. They started questioning the myth of the self-sufficient pioneer family, started pointing out that homesteading was often a disaster, that most families failed, that the whole system was built on land theft and violence. They started digging into Laura's real life, finding the census records, the land claims, the debts. And they started realizing that the story wasn't quite what they'd been told. In 2018, the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award, a prestigious children's literature award that had been named after her since 1954, was renamed because of the racism in her books. The award is now called the Children's Literature Legacy Award. Laura's name was removed. Some people were outraged. They said it was erasing history, cancelling a beloved author for things that were normal in her time. Other people said it was necessary, that honouring someone whose books contained racist language and ideas sent the wrong message to children. And both sides had a point, because Laura's legacy is complicated. Her books are genuinely beloved. They've brought comfort and joy to millions of people. They've taught children about resilience and family and history. But they also contain racism. They also perpetuate myths about the frontier that aren't true. They also erase the real cost of westward expansion. So what do we do with that? Do we throw the books away, pretend they never mattered, or do we keep them but read them critically? Acknowledge the problems while still appreciating the storytelling? There's no easy answer. But here's what's clear. Laura Ingalls Wilder never intended to become a symbol. She never intended her books to be treated as historical fact. She never intended to shape how generations of Americans understood their own past. She just wanted to tell a story that would sell, that would provide financial security, that would turn a lifetime of struggle into something meaningful, and she succeeded. But success came with a cost. Her story became the story. Her version of the frontier became the accepted version. And the truth, messy, complicated, uncomfortable truth, got buried. So here we are, at the end of the story, and you have to ask yourself, what did you learn? Did you learn that Laura Ingalls Wilder was a liar? That the Little House books are worthless? I hope not. Because that's not the point. The point is that all stories are constructions, all memories are edited, all history is shaped by who's telling it and why. Laura didn't lie to deceive you. She lied to survive. She took a childhood of poverty and displacement and turned it into a story of resilience. She took a father who failed repeatedly and turned him into a hero. She took a mother who suffered silently and turned her into a saint. She took her own struggles, marrying the wrong man, losing children, failing at farming, and turned them into lessons about perseverance. And she did it so well that millions of people believed her, still believe her. But now you know the truth. You know that Charles Ingalls moved his family 17 times in 30 years, not because he was a brave pioneer, but because he couldn't hold on to anything. You know that Caroline Ingalls followed him not because she believed in his dreams, but because she had no other choice. You know that Laura married a man just like her father, and spent 40 years watching him fail the same way. You know that the Little House books were written by two people, not one. That scenes were invented, that characters were changed, that the whole thing is as much fiction as fact. You know that the frontier wasn't empty, that Native Americans were forced off their land to make room for families like the Ingalls, that the whole system was built on violence and dispossession. You know that most homesteaders failed, that the success stories were exceptions, not the rule. You know all of this now, and you can't unknow it. So what do you do with that knowledge? You could decide that the Little House books are ruined, that you can't enjoy them anymore, that knowing the truth behind them makes them unreadable. Or you could decide that they're more interesting now, more human, more worth thinking about. Because Laura's lies tell us something important about how we construct narratives, about how we make sense of the past, about how we turn suffering into meaning. She lied, yes, but she lied in the service of something bigger than herself. She lied to give people hope during the Great Depression. She lied to teach children that hard work and family could get you through anything. She lied to turn her own pain into something useful. And maybe that's not entirely wrong. Maybe all storytelling is lying. Maybe all history is myth-making. Maybe the question isn't, is this true? But what does this story do? And the Little House books do a lot. They comfort, they teach, they inspire, but they also obscure, they simplify, they erase, and both things can be true at the same time. Netflix is rebooting Little House on the Prairie. They're going to retell Laura's story for a new generation, and they're going to face a choice. Do they tell the myth, or do they tell the truth? My guess? They'll tell the myth. Because the myth is easier. The myth is more comforting. The myth is what people want. But I hope they at least consider the truth. I hope they consider showing Charles Ingalls as he really was. Charming but reckless. Loving but unable to provide stability. I hope they consider showing Caroline's exhaustion, her grief, her quiet resentment. I hope they consider showing Laura's anger, her complexity, her awareness that her childhood wasn't an adventure, but a series of disasters. I hope they consider showing the Osage families whose land was taken, the Lakota people who watched their territory shrink, the reality of what westward expansion actually meant. I hope they consider showing the failures, the debts, the times the Ingalls family ran away in the middle of the night. Because that story, the complicated, uncomfortable, messy story, is more valuable than the myth. Not because it's more uplifting, it's not, but because it's more honest, and honestly matters, especially now when there's so much mythology about American history. So many stories that smooth over the ugly parts and make the past seem simpler than it was. We need stories that tell the truth, not perfect truth, that doesn't exist, but more truth, better truth. Truth that acknowledges complexity and doesn't shy away from difficulty. We need to know that Laura Ingalls Wilder was a real person, not a character. That she struggled, that she failed, that she made choices that weren't always noble, that she lied about her past not out of malice but out of survival, that she created something beautiful, but that beauty came at a cost. We need to know all of this, because if we only know the myth, we're lying to ourselves, and we're doing the same thing Laura did, choosing comfort over truth. So let me tell you who Laura Ingalls Wilder really was. She was a woman born into poverty in 1867 in a log cabin in Wisconsin. She was a woman who moved constantly throughout her childhood, never staying anywhere long enough to feel at home. She was a woman who watched her father fail again and again, and her mother hold the family together through sheer determination. She was a woman who married young to a man who seemed stable and then watched him fail too. She was a woman who lost children, who worked harder than most people can imagine, who spent 40 years struggling to build something that would last. She was a woman who finally, at 64, found success, not through farming or homesteading, but through writing. She was a woman who took her painful memories and shaped them into stories that would comfort millions of people. And she was a woman who, in doing so, buried her own truth so deep that it took historians decades to dig it out. Laura Ingalls Wilder was complicated. She was sharp and observant and remembered everything. She was also willing to lie, to soften the truth, to make her story more palatable. She was a survivor, a fighter, a woman who refused to let her hard life break her. She was also someone who perpetuated myths about the frontier that weren't true, who erased the suffering of Native Americans, who turned her father's failures into noble struggles. She was human, and that's what Netflix won't show. They'll show you the myth, the little girl in the sunbonnet, the family in the covered wagon, the cozy cabin in the woods. They won't show you the woman crying at her desk, trying to decide which memories to keep and which to bury. They won't show you the daughter rewriting her mother's words, shaping them into something more sellable. They won't show you the lies underneath the beauty. But now you know. You know what's behind the curtain. You know that the Little House books are beautiful, but they're not true, not entirely. And you know that Laura Ingalls Wilder was a survivor, a writer, a myth maker. But most of all, she was human, flawed, complicated, real. And that's the story worth knowing. The story Netflix won't tell. But the story that, maybe, we need most of all. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, think about Laura. Not the character in the books, but the real woman. The woman who survived poverty and loss and displacement. The woman who turned that survival into art. The woman who lied to make the truth bearable. And ask yourself, what stories are you telling about your own life? What are you leaving out? What are you softening? What are you making prettier than it was? Because we all do it. We all construct narratives. We all choose which memories to keep and which to forget. We're all, in our own way, Laura Ingalls Wilder, creating myths, telling stories, surviving, and maybe that's okay, as long as we remember that the story isn't the same as the truth, and the myth isn't the same as the reality, as long as we're willing to look behind the curtain every now and then, and see the complicated, messy human truth underneath. Good night, sleep well, and remember, the past is never as simple as the stories make it sound.